Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink, it is time for some Path of Exile discussion. Welcome to day 18 of teaser season for patch 3.28 and the upcoming Settlers of Kalguur expansion. Today, we've got a lot of very small things that really do add up to a big cohesive whole. Today, we got the item filter information. Now this is very big news if your name is Neversink, and it's also very big news if you're the sort of person who builds a loot filter from scratch without using external tools. If you're in that category, you really need to pay attention to this. You need to study this document, and I'll put a link to it down in the description below. If that's not you though, we're going to do a very casual perusal of it because there's not anything that really needs to be gone into in depth. There's a number of other little changes the patch notes will go through, including a correction to an error that was made yesterday, and the recently asked questions section has been set up by Grinding Gear Games. We'll go through everything that's in there so far, but these do tend to keep getting updated throughout the day, so it's entirely possible that by the time you're seeing this, 3 or 4 more questions might have been asked. Anyways, let's start with the correction. Yesterday's video I mentioned that the glass shank had been listed erroneously in a line that said that base critical strike chance was increasing from 6% to 7% on a bunch of weapons. I misinterpreted that to think that that meant that it was going to stay at 6%. Actually, no, it's going up to 7.5%. The reason that this matters though, it's not just that you'll use this weapon for a few levels very, very early in the game, and at which point you probably aren't scaling critical strikes anyway. It's for endgame, and that's because animate weapon, if you raise a lingering blade, it uses the stats of a glass shank. So this is actually quite a big buff to animate weapon. It's going to increase the base critical strike chance of animate weapons that are summoned with that spell. So it's kind of a corner case, but this is actually an endgame change, not just an early game change. Only works with lingering blades. If you're animating a real weapon, then it'll use the weapon stats instead. There's a few other changes to the patch notes that are new today. The first one is that Death Aura is getting a buff. This is summoned by the unique chest armor, Death's Oath. This is still probably not good enough. It's getting quite a big buff. It's getting like 33% more damage, but I don't think that's enough because a few leagues ago, Death's Oath was caught in the crossfire when Grinding Gear Games needed to nerf poison. They nerfed poison in a way that caught chaos damage over time builds in the crossfire, and they haven't really recovered from it. And whilst 33% more damage does help towards that, I don't think it's enough. If this was 1250 base chaos damage, then I would be saying, yeah, that does make up for that previous nerf and might actually put it into a reasonable spot as a league starter. But at 1000, I'm just going to say probably not. If you really like Death's Oath playstyle, you can force it, but I don't think it's going to perform admirably or anything like it. There are some slight changes to the exact wording that's used on Fast Shot, the new version of Fast Shot that exists on the Deadeye Ascendancy, and this is going to only take away a couple of really corner case situations. If you are planning a league starter that is based around using Decay support and the Deadeye Ascendancy together, then this is going to ruin your day. You probably, however, were not planning a league starter that was based around Decay support and the Deadeye. There's a couple of other things that deal flat chaos damage over time that are neither hits nor ailments like Decay support, and those will no longer scale with Fast Shot. A meaningful typo has been corrected on one of the Totem masteries, so added totems taunt enemies around them for 1 second when summoned was the intended wording. Yesterday they said stunned, which seemed a little bit weird, but I thought it was right. No, it's wrong. It's now been fixed. If you want that behaviour, spec that mastery. If you don't want that behaviour, and keep in mind that having things taunting can sometimes be beneficial, sometimes detrimental, if you don't want that behaviour, you don't need to spec into it because it's a mastery. Perfect place for it to be, something that I think maybe 5% of Totem players will want, but the 5% that want it will love it. Next, Eternal Damnation is eternally damned, yet this item's getting nerfed before it goes live in the form that it was going to go live in. This is going to be fairly significant. Maximum Endurance Frenzy and Power Charges is 0, is a drawback that's going to apply to newly created versions of Eternal Damnation. If you've got one of these in Standard, you probably want to keep it if you care about Standard at all. Now, Eternal Damnation is getting nerfed like this because of the enormous buff that Endurance Charges were going to get in patch 3.25. It's very important to know that if you have both a maximum and a minimum endurance charge number that conflict with each other, for example, maybe you have maximum endurance charges of 0 and minimum endurance charges of 3 through the use of various Grand Spectrum jewels, in that situation, the 0 wins out. So in that sense, the maximum is somewhat absolute. Eternal Damnation is still going to be a very usable item, but it's going to be weaker than it would have been if it had gone live in its pre-nerf form. And if you're disappointed that Grinding Gear Games are nerfing the monster damage in tier 17 maps too much, don't worry about it, you can now make them 100% delirious. And doing that will pretty much exactly counteract the nerf to the damage that monsters have got. So if you want 3.24 damage output on monsters that are found inside tier 17 maps, you can achieve that by slamming 5 Delirium Orbs on the maps. You can now do that again, whereas previously the only way to get a Delirious tier 17 map was to have it drop in conjunction with either the Scarab that forces every map to drop with layers of Delirium, or with the Atlas support that gives a 1 in 25 chance for maps to drop with layers of Delirium applied. And finally, Groninger Games mentioned they were going to be buffing the Dancing Dervish so much that it was going to become something that pretty much everyone felt compelled to use. This is being reverted, and the Dancing Dervish is not receiving that buff, so you can put something else in your offhand, and you won't feel like it's necessary to fit the Dancing Dervish into every build. So this is one of those things where there is a buff to player agency, in that you don't need to do this obscure thing, but also a nerf to player power over what it would have been if that had gone live. Anyways, that's all of the things that are in the patch notes. Let's jump over to the item filter stuff. We'll go through this quickly because there's not a lot that matters to every Path of Exile player, but there is a lot that matters to some of you. Here we've got a list of all the new items that are being added to the game first. The new skill gems are listed, the new support gems are listed, and one of the new skill gems is not listed, and that is the transfigured version of Puncture. We have 5 new divination cards coming: Father's Love, Avian Pursuit, Temperance, Lonely Warrior, and Toxic Tidings. And if I was asked to make a guess, I would say perhaps that the Temperance card may relate to a Tempering Orb that's found in Heist, although we're going to find that out for sure once the divination card is actually available to be data mined. Side note on data mining. Data mining is going to be really slow. If you're familiar with the website POE, the person who runs that is off on a much deserved holiday at the moment, and that means that they're not going to be back in time for league start. So some of this stuff might not actually be found until people make Reddit posts about them a day or so into the league once they're actually found. Next we have the Nameless Ring. The Nameless Ring is a new base that seems like it's only going to exist initially as unique items that are being added to the King in the Mist encounter. Now this base is going to be 50% increased elemental ailment duration on you, 50% reduced effective curses on you. My understanding is that that is one single line, and so if you were to apply a Vaal Orb to it and it was to roll that it was going to give you a Vaal Implicit, the Vaal Implicit would overwrite both lines. I could, however, be wrong. It could be that you just get the drawback removed and you get to keep all of the benefits of it. Then we've got the Selfish Shepherd and also the Hateful Accuser, which are on the same base and are different items. Something to keep in mind though is that if you were to Vaal these and they were to brick into rare items, you could conceivably use the 5-for-1 vendor recipe. Vendor 5 rare items and receive back a rare item unidentified on the same base. This will no longer be corrupted, and that will mean that you'll be able to craft on a Nameless Ring if you want. Whether this is practical or not remains to be seen. I don't think that this is necessarily the strongest base in the world, although there will be some vanity projects undoubtedly that go on with it. And of course, people always like playing around with fun toys that no one else has, even if that toy is not necessarily the strongest thing in the world. The next section deals with the names of all of the new crafting bases that are going to drop. This information really isn't all that important for you unless you're someone who just cares about the lore of some of the items. Level 84 ones are going to be really, really good. Level 75 ones, you're definitely going to want to pick them up whenever they drop rare. We have no idea how rare these are going to be, but they will be better than existing bases. For example, the Necrotic Armor will be the top tier version of the Sadist Garb, and you probably never craft anything other than a Necrotic Armor except while you're leveling and early in endgame. And at that point, you might use a Sadist Garb, but you probably want to use a Sanguine Raiment or a Torturer Garb instead until you can get a Necrotic Armor. The other thing is that these bases are going to be very, very valuable if they drop with RNG 30% quality on them, so definitely keep an eye out for those. Don't expect them to be cheap at all. The other items that are being added to the game, there's gold, there's an audience with the king, which is something you'll be able to find in rituals sometimes, and this is the way that you now fight the king in the mist. And then there is the item class of stackable currency, which includes the Prismatic Oil, the Reflecting Mist, which is a new version of the Calandra mechanic. This is going to be fully tradable, so none of the messing around with trading an instance it's in that you had in Calandra. The 5 new Maven's Chisels, and then all of the runes that are used to add enchantments to certain weapons. Note that these enchantments can only be applied to rare weapons, they cannot be applied to unique weapons, and this prohibition also prevents the item from then being turned into a unique item later through the use of a Chance Orb or similar mechanics. Then we've got all the names of the tinctures. Note that the tinctures do not have the same effects that they had in 3.23, so if you're familiar with what they did back then, it's not going to be the same necessarily. And all of the various premium corpses that are going to be existing, another Affliction era mechanic that is returning to the game with 3.25. A couple of items are getting renamed as well, and the most noticeable things here, we're seeing all the changes that are in the patch notes to various scarabs. Perfect Fossil is being completely overhauled as the Opulent Fossil, and we still don't have information on exactly what that's going to do. And then there's the changes to various ritual bases, and a few items that are being removed, which is nothing that should surprise you if you've been paying attention to the patch notes. After that, we have the map tiers. Now, I'm not going to go through everything here, and also one thing that's very important is that with the Divination card reshuffle, we still don't know whether certain Divination cards that you might have considered farming early are going to be available in maps that you would historically have connected them with. For example, most of the time I would have said, hey, tier 2's got Dungeon. That's a terrible map, but we could go and farm Chains that Bind there. That said, we just don't know if Chains that Bind is going to drop in Dungeon anymore. Maybe it's going to drop somewhere else. So that's something that we'll have to look into once we either get information on what Divination cards drop where, or alternately, once the league actually goes live. The one thing that you can potentially say a bit more about though, tier 16, we have Orchid, which is mediocre to bad, Crystal Ore, mediocre to bad, Sepulchre, mediocre to bad, and Lighthouse, which is mediocre. In short, Horizon Orbs are not going to be the central of the meta this league, because there's nothing really fantastic that you can get there. Finally, there's a few returning Divination cards, ones that were not able to drop previously that are being made available again. That's all the information that's there. I'll put a link to it in the description if you're in that subset of players that needs to pay more attention to it, e.g. if you're never sync or if you're someone that makes your own loot filters. Alright, let's go through the recently asked questions, which have a number of important things in them. Firstly, there was a banner mastery that was going to be completely broken. It is not going to be completely broken. This 8% increased damage that enemies suffer, which is not 8% increased damage your character deals, it's 8% damage that stacks additively with shock. This is not going to scale with banner aura effect. This is probably for the best because you can get a huge amount of increased banner aura effect, and so it was going to feel like it was just a mandatory thing every character would have to fit into their build because it was going to more than double the damage that monsters took. Anyways, that's not going to happen, and instead you're going to be capped at that 8%. It's still worth taking if you're using banners, but it's not something that's ridiculous. How does Valor work? It's a shared counter on your character rather than being tied to a specific banner skill. How does the banner mastery that grants Valor when you Warcry work with triggered Warcries? The answer is it does. So it's going to then provide you with Valor every time that you use one of those annoying repeated auto-exertion. How does Perfect Agony interact with Ignite Proliferation, Pathfinder's Master Toxicist, and the like? They still function as normal because they're not inflicted by hits, and therefore they're not turned off by being inflicted by a hit that was not a critical hit. With the changes to weapon quality, is this going to apply to Harvest enchantments? No, it's not going to apply to them. They're still going to do the same thing they used to do, which is going to mean that they're often going to feel worse than they did in 3.24. The opportunity cost has gone up, but the reward for using them has not gone up. One question that I've seen a lot is relating to things that double attack speed modifiers. So there is a node in the Gladiator, the Determined Survivor node, that doubles the inherent effect of dual wielding. So that doubles the 10% increased attack speed up to 20% among doing other things. And there's also a Claw Mastery that does something similar as well. Will these stack? No, they won't. Doubling is something you either have or you don't. You don't get it twice. That's a general rule of thumb in Path of Exile, and there is no exception for it here. What's happening to Mahuxotl's Machination? The answer is there's no real change to it, which means that it's going to be much worse as a result of all of these changes. Vaal Pact's changes are going to somewhat brick what Mahuxotl's Machination was usually used for. It sort of still works in some situations, but it's not intended to be something that's necessarily a super powerful item. It's intended as something that's weird and wonderful. And where in the past it was fairly powerful, it's probably going to be worse in a lot of situations as a result of these changes. How much damage do I need to inflict shock when I have the Warden's Oath of Spring node active? How does it interact with increased effect or increased maximum effect of shock? Oath of Spring doesn't change the minimum amount of damage you need to shock an enemy. The 2% shock effect value is an override, and your stats cannot modify it further. Increased shock effect does allow you to apply this shock with smaller hits than you otherwise would need to. How does the new tier 17 map mod that fractures monsters on death work? The answer is it's a lot less crazy than the one that some of you might remember from long ago in Path of Exile's history. I think it was added in Nemesis League. There was a mod that caused monsters when they died the first time to fracture, and this would then cause, I think it was 8 monsters to spawn that were all copies of the original monster, and those monsters would die normally. I might have some of the numbers wrong there, but essentially it was something that seemed like it was really great until you realized, oh, this is causing havoc on my PC's performance. When a rare monster dies, it will have a 25% chance to fracture with the new fracture mod. When this happens, it will fracture into a magic monster for each of the modifiers it had. So a 4 mod rare would become 4 magic monsters, each of which will have one of these mods, and that's only a 25% chance to happen. If it doesn't happen, then the rare monster just dies normally. In short, this mod is going to be absolutely heavenly to encounter if you have something like Ignite Proliferation on your build, and it's going to be a moderate nuisance for melee builds. Dancing Dervish feels like it will become mandatory on every build. Can we prevent this, please? Yes, we have. It's been nerfed. Is Hoarfrost an ailment? No, Hoarfrost is a regular debuff. Now this comes from the Oath of Winter, which is one of the options in the new Warden Ascendancy. Is a 2-second freeze from Warden's Oath of Winter passive affected by freeze duration modifiers? Oath of Winter is going to check the final freeze duration. If it is less than 2 seconds, it brings it up to 2 seconds. If it's more than 2 seconds, it doesn't shrink it down to 2 seconds. Does gold scale with modifiers to quantity of items found in an area? What about resources from the Settlers of Kalguur mining encounters? Gold's a regular item drop. Anything that causes more items to drop will naturally cause you to find more gold. The mining resources you gain do scale with item quantity in endgame maps, but at a reduced rate. So there's a few things in the game that scale with area quantity, but not at 100%. So for instance, I believe that Delve Sulfite in a zone scales with 3/4 of the zone quantity. What that means is that a scaled map, that's going to give you 100% of the baseline amount of Delve Goo, but then if that map had 80% quantity on it from various things, map modifiers, quality and the like, you would only get 60% of an increase, so you'd get 160% of the base amount of sulfite. I'm assuming that the Kalguur mining encounters might work in a similar way. Maybe they're scaled at 50% of area quantity, maybe at 75%. We'll have to find that out over time. Does Fast Shot's new damage bonus apply to all damage or just a subset of damage? This is something we discussed in the patch notes. It's going to be hits and ailments only. Do Oath of Spring, Winter and Summer work with mines, or are the hits required to be from weapons? So this is 3 of the Warden nodes. All of these nodes work with any damage aside from minions, including spells, traps, totems, and mines. However, Unbound Fury from the Avatar of the Wilds node does require you to hit the enemies yourself and will not be generated when you hit them through proxies like totems, traps, and mines. How does Valor work? How do we generate it? What's the maximum? Here's a reminder text that shows up on the banner skills. By default, you gain 1 Valor on a melee kill or a melee hit against rare or unique enemies, hard capped at once per 500 milliseconds, up to a maximum of 50 Valor. There are a number of ways that you can increase this by speccing into Valor related things on the passive tree. If you have 2 tinctures active using Warden's Experienced Herbalist passive, and you take the Nature's Concoction Notable passive as well, and you have a flask that's adjacent to 2 of the active tinctures, does it gain 2 charges on hit or 4? The answer is 2. Again, this is that thing where doubling something is something that only happens once in Path of Exile. That's almost always the case. Next question deals with interactions between Vaal Pact and Slayer Leech. Remember that Vaal Pact is now going back to being instantaneous leech, but it has a number of drawbacks on it. The short version of this answer is don't take Vaal Pact on a Slayer. The longer version of this answer, Vaal Pact's interaction with the overleech section of Slayer Leech. This does not interact with Vaal Pact at all. Vaal Pact causes all leech instances to be applied immediately regardless of how much life you have, so that will still happen if you have Brutal Fervor. Secondly, the overkill damage leech aspect of the Slayer. This comes from Endless Hunger. This is assigned to the damage that killed the monster, so with Vaal Pact allocated, it will be instantaneous from melee kills, and it will be standard leech if it is not a melee kill, because Vaal Pact is melee based. It is worth noting that the overkill leech is a separate instance of leech from the hits leech, which can be quite advantageous even with Vaal Pact. However, none of the while leeching stats on Endless Hunger function with instant leech. So the super short version here is that if you're playing the Slayer Ascendancy, don't spec Vaal Pact. Vaal Pact does definitely have a place, but that place is somewhere else. Can you apply the new Runesmithing enchantments to unique weapons? No, and this will also not work with methods of turning an item into a unique item. Eternal Damnation and Ralakesh boots feels a little OP. Do you plan to change these? Hey, remember that nerf to Eternal Damnation that was in the patch notes? That's the reason for it. Thanks, Ralakesh boots. You've been nerfed already, but you're still causing other things to get nerfed as well. How does the Taming interact with Warden's Oath of Spring? This one's been adjusted and we've discussed that in the Day 17 video. What happens if you allocate both Perfect Agony and Elemental Overload? The answer is you will be very sad. If you allocate Perfect Agony on your stat, do sources of damage over time multiplier do anything useful for your character? The answer is generally going to be no. There are corner cases where it will apply, but those are the cases where Perfect Agony isn't working because you're dealing damage over time that is not from an ailment. Essentially the answer is no, this is not a combo. What sources of critical strike multiplier work with the reworked Perfect Agony keystone? All of them work. it copies the critical strike multiplier from the hit that's applying the ailment. So any critical strike multiplier that applied to that hit will also apply to your damage over time multiplier, including things that rely it to be from a weapon or that are highly conditional. So in short, Perfect Agony is really good with all sorts of obscure sources of critical strike multiplier. Doesn't matter what they're from. Where this is going to be really weird is in conjunction with skills that have unusual tags and unexpected tags. For example, if someone was to be igniting with the skill Wave of Conviction, and they're using Critical Strike and Perfect Agony set up to do that, then they may actually benefit from Lightning Critical Strike Multiplier, because that's going to then cause Wave of Conviction to have higher Critical Strike Multiplier, and then Wave of Conviction's Critical Strike Multiplier is then going to overwrite the dot multi for ailments inflicted by critical strikes from Wave of Conviction. So keep this in mind. Some things that would have been in the past completely useless duels will end up having some uses as a result of this change. How does Aggravated Bleeding work with multiple stacks of bleeding, and how does it interact with Crimson Dance? So firstly, let's get Crimson Dance out of the way. That's exactly the way that I mentioned it in the Gladiator video. It doesn't work for you. Basically, Crimson Dance ruins Aggravating Bleeding entirely. Secondly, being aggravated is a property of each individual bleeding debuff. Stats that grant a chance to aggravate bleeding aggravate all bleeding on the target at once if they trigger, other than the one that aggravates bleeding older than 4 seconds. They do not have separate percentage chance procs for each individual bleed. The extra damage from aggravated bleeding is separate to bleeding's normal damage. This is the thing that was not obvious at all, and this is something that makes bleeding more strong than it would be otherwise. This means that if you aggravate 100 DPS bleed on a target, that target is now taking 100 normal bleed DPS and 200 aggravated bleeded DPS, as long as it's stationary. If you then inflict a 200 DPS normal bleed, that will take precedence over the normal damage from the smaller bleed, but the aggravated damage from that first bleed will still apply. So this means that the target will take 400 DPS when stationary, which is 200 from the biggest normal bleed that's on it, plus 200 from the biggest while moving penalty that applies to it, because there's an aggravated bleed and that counts as moving. And when it actually starts moving, that then escalates to 600, 200 plus 400 instead. Note that when you roll a proc that aggravates existing bleeds on a monster, it does not aggravate bleeds that are inflicted with the same attack. How does Gladiator's Determined Survivor node interact with the block chance of my shield? It is an override. It doesn't care about any other modifiers on the shield. This came up a little bit in the discussion of my Gladiator video. Someone had the opposite interpretation, actually an interpretation I hadn't thought of, which was that if you had the unique shield Broken Faith, then your final block chance would be 40%, not 50%. And this is just Grinding Gear Games confirming no, that will be 50%. Does Oath of Winter still require you to deal a certain minimum amount of damage to inflict Hoarfrost? The answer is yes, but it just needs to be enough to try to get a 1 millisecond freeze. And they're saying here that that is about 1/60th of 1% of a monster's life. I believe that should actually be 1/60th of 1% of the ailment threshold of the monster, which is a big difference for things like the Uber Maven and the Uber Cortex, where if my memory serves me correctly on those two bosses, the ailment threshold and the hit points are very, very far apart. If you've got regrets, but too few regret orbs to mention, then you can use gold to respec your character, but you can also use Orbs of Regret still. You've got both of those are options in 3.25. Are the various resources that are in the Settlers of Kalguur expansion tradable? The answer is no. You can only use these resources to either upgrade your town or to send off a shipment, which will then get you tradable loot. How does Rage on Hit work with multiple sources of the stat? They basically stack in the most favourable way that you would expect them to, so Rage gains are additive and the lockout timer is shared. Does the Deadeye Frenzy node work when using Flicker Strike? The answer here is no, because teleport move skills such as Flicker Strike, but also including things like Frostblink, these do not consider you to be moving except possibly on the frame that you actually translocate from place to place, and so you won't have been consistently moving in order to gain your Frenzy charges from the Deadeye node. With item quantity being removed from items, what will happen with race rewards that have quantity on them? Those are going to be standard only now. Those are no longer going to be able to be withdrawn in temporary leagues at all, whereas previously they were able to be withdrawn after a month. What's happening to the Barkskin skill on the Warden? There's actually a few changes here. If you're intending to use it, I highly recommend coming and having a look at the exact details of it here. It is looking really good. It's only reserving 10% of your mana. You gain 1 bark per second if you haven't been hit by an enemy attack recently, lose 1 bark when hit by an enemy attack. You have a maximum of 10 bark. When you are at high levels of bark, it will reduce the amount of physical attack that you take from attack hits, and this will be a flat reduction. So if you go 10 seconds without taking any hits, the first hit is going to be reduced by 300, the second by 270, then 240, and so on and so forth. They're actually pretty substantial, And for each bark that you are missing on your character, you have 2% more chance to evade attacks. This can add up quite a bit, and ultimately it's a powerful package if you are simultaneously investing in armor and evasion, and it's still potentially fairly useful if you are solely investing in evasion. You do need to have some investment in evasion though, otherwise you're going to find that you're going to be hit very, very frequently, and then at that point you're going to wind up in a situation where you gain nothing from this. You would gain something from this, but you don't have any bark to remove. In short, if you are intending to use a fairly large amount of evasion on your character and at least a modest amount of armor, then this should be a strong pull to consider the Warden Ascendancy. What's happening with Affliction Corpses? Yes, they're all coming back, but they're going to have balance changes, and some of the auras that they could provide are getting nerfed. Is there a maximum number of trades in the currency exchange? Yep, that's 10. And how do the maps that your runners complete interact with your Atlas tree? The answer is they don't. So that's all the information today between the recently asked questions, the patch note changes, and also the item filter information. If you've got any comments or questions, definitely fire away below. Otherwise, I'm going to leave it there, except to say that I'm going to be brainstorming my potential league starter here. I am really thinking of going Ground Slam on a Chieftain, seeing what we can make work with that, seeing if it looks like it's got enough potential to at least get my own 4 Voidstones. If it looks like it's going to be good, then I'll definitely share it with the rest of the community, but that's something that I will brainstorm over on Twitch at some point later on today. May your Vaal Orbs have interesting results.